The series begins in 1989 in Colombia, and we learn that drug trafficking was extraordinarily widespread in the country at that time, with drugs being smuggled from Colombia to the United States. For this reason, the U.S. was providing support to the Colombian police to catch drug traffickers in order to eliminate this ongoing headache. At that time, wiretapping technology wasn't as advanced as it is today. The U.S. was only able to intercept wireless phones. They needed a plane to fly over the area near the wireless phone to capture the signals. However, there was another problem. While they could intercept these phones, they couldn't identify the speaker. So, the U.S. developed voice recognition technology to identify speakers. Now, we move to one of the U.S. security centers in Colombia, where they receive a signal from a drug dealer named Poison, and they discover that he is on his way to a certain restaurant to meet another drug dealer named Lizard. Immediately, an officer on the scene contacts Murphy, a DEA officer now in Colombia, to inform him of everything that is happening. Murphy instantly contacts a Colombian officer named Carrillo to inform him of the information. Carrillo and his team rush to the restaurant where Poison and Lizard are, and they open fire on everyone there, successfully completing the mission. But, let's rewind a bit to understand how Officer Murphy reached this point, working in Colombia and assisting the Colombian police in catching drug traffickers. In the 1970s, we moved to Chile, which was ruled by a dictator named Pinochet, heavily supported by the United States. The U.S. feared that if Pinochet were overthrown, the communists would take control of the country. For this reason, they supported Pinochet with all their might. At that time, Chile was a major center for drug dealers and the smuggling of drugs into the U.S. As a result, Pinochet launched a campaign against drug dealers and arrested them all, but he didn't stop there. He killed them and buried them in mass graves. On one occasion, soldiers had gathered a group of traffickers to kill them, but after the soldiers left, one of the traffickers survived because no bullets hit him. This trafficker was named Mateo Moreno, known by the nickname La Cucaracha because he liked that name. After surviving, he returned home, took his wife, and fled the country to Colombia, the new drug trafficking hub after Chile. La Cucaracha needed to collaborate with a new smuggler in Colombia to smuggle the drugs he produced to other countries. At the time, Colombia was home to three notorious smuggling gangs. The first was the Ochoa Brothers gang, three brothers, Jorge and Fabio, who smuggled everything from Colombia to anywhere in the world. However, their problem was that they were very expensive, which is why La Cucaracha decided not to deal with them. He was left with two options. The first gang was led by Jose Gacha, a madman who would kill anyone at any time without reason. So, La Cucaracha stayed away from him. The last gang was led by Pablo Escobar and his cousin Gustavo. At that time, Pablo and Gustavo were smuggling simple items like electrical devices and televisions. In one operation, they were stopped by the Colombian police, led by Herrera, who initially decided to detain them. However, Pablo told him that he knew him and his entire family, and that if he didn't let them continue their work, he would wipe them all out, one by one. At that moment, Herrera realized that Pablo was not someone to be trifled with, and instead of arresting him, he decided to cooperate with him in exchange for a bribe. That night, Pablo and Gustavo met with La Cucaracha, who told them that he made cocaine and wanted to smuggle it to Peru, where he could sell a gram for $10. But Pablo suggested a better idea, smuggling cocaine to Miami in the United States, where they could sell the gram for a much higher price. La Cucaracha was impressed with the idea, and they decided to start smuggling drugs to Miami instead of Peru. Moving to Miami, we see that Officer Murphy and his colleague Kevin work for the DEA there, where marijuana trafficking was very widespread. One day, they chase a suspect involved in marijuana trafficking and easily catch him. Afterwards, they go together to celebrate at a casino. During the celebration, Kevin tells Murphy that there's a girl at the place who is interested in him. The naive Murphy believes it, but it was just a prank by Kevin. Nonetheless, Murphy goes to the girl and asks for her number. She initially refuses, but after his persistence, she gives him a number. When Murphy returns home and calls the number, he finds out that it was indeed the girl's number. From that moment, Murphy falls in love with her and eventually marries her. On the other hand, we see that Pablo and Gustavo go to visit La Cucaracha in Peru. It becomes clear that La Cucaracha had set up a small lab in Peru to manufacture cocaine. Pablo began taking drugs from La Cucaracha and sending them to Colombia to be sold there and smuggled to America as well. After a while, Pablo noticed that the business was growing and expanding, and that he needed La Cucaracha by his side more frequently. So, he bought a house in Colombia and asked La Cucaracha to manufacture the cocaine there. Later, we see Pablo at home with his mother and his wife, Tata. We learn that they are fully aware of his activities, as Pablo's mother was making him a jacket with secret pockets to smuggle drugs. Gustavo arrives at the house with another man named Leon, and we learn that Leon will be placing the drugs in the jacket made by Pablo's mother to smuggle them to America. When Leon arrives in America, he meets another man named Letter, and we find out that Letter will be responsible for distributing the drugs in America. Over time, the business grew so much that Leon could no longer smuggle the drugs by himself, so he hired other people to help him. These people were diverse, including pilots, women, and others. After some time, the smuggling expanded, and Pablo had to hide the drugs in food shipments sent from Colombia to America, like potatoes and coffee. Once, Pablo and Gustavo went to meet with Letter, who told them that he had purchased a private plane capable of transporting more than 1,300 kilograms of cocaine in one trip to Miami. Of course, everyone was thrilled, and they decided to increase their activity. As the business grew, Pablo set up cocaine labs in remote areas in the jungle so that no one could reach them. On another occasion, Pablo and Gustavo visited the lab in the jungle and met with La Cucaracha there. La Cucaracha expressed his dissatisfaction to Pablo, feeling that Pablo no longer valued him in the business as he used to and that he was receiving far less money than he deserved, even though he was the one who introduced Pablo to this business in the first place. From that moment, Pablo began to feel uneasy about La Cucaracha and was convinced that one day he would come to claim what he thought was his. Some time passed, and we see Pablo sitting with Gotcha and a member of the Ochoa brothers gang. An agreement was made between Pablo and them that he would smuggle their cocaine to Miami, as they were having difficulty smuggling it themselves. In return, Pablo would take 35% of the value of each shipment. Everyone agreed to this deal, and as a result, cocaine spread in Miami to the extent that the police, led by Murphy, found themselves engaging in daily shootouts with drug traffickers there. On one occasion, Murphy killed a cocaine dealer who was no older than 17. Although Murphy killed him in self-defense, he felt deeply saddened by it. Back in Colombia, we see La Cucaracha going to meet Gustavo, asking him to arrange a meeting with Pablo to increase his share of the money. But Gustavo refuses and tells La Cucaracha to stay away from Pablo or else he will kill him. La Cucaracha reluctantly agrees but secretly decides to deceive both Gustavo and Pablo. Later, we see the police, led by Herrera, intercepting Pablo's men smuggling drugs and arresting them. Although Herrera had an agreement with Pablo, he still arrested them, and we will later find out why he did this. The next day, Pablo learns from Gustavo that Herrera had seized their cocaine shipments, which enrages Pablo. He goes to Herrera at the police station and, without any introduction, starts cursing him angrily. Herrera responds, and they decide to call in forensic photographers to document the moment of Pablo's arrest. Those photos taken of Pablo would cost him dearly in the future, as his features became known in criminal records. After that, Herrera summoned Pablo and told him that he didn't want any problems with him, but that Pablo had to increase the money he was paying him from $150,000 to $1 million per shipment, especially since each shipment was being sold for $5 million. Pablo considered the matter and asked Herrera to tell him who had leaked the price of the shipment to him, promising to increase the amount in exchange for knowing this person. Herrera told Pablo that it was La Cucaracha who had leaked this information to him and also informed him that La Cucaracha was smuggling drugs behind his back in Miami and selling them for his own benefit. This drove Pablo into a rage, and he decided to end La Cucaracha's life as soon as possible. But wait, who is La Cucaracha's drug dealer in Miami? We find out his identity when we see Murphy and Officer Kevin undercover, waiting for the cocaine dealer to buy drugs from him, but they were actually planning to arrest him. Shortly after, the dealer arrives, and his name is Herman. We learn that Herman is La Cucaracha's dealer in Miami. Everything was going smoothly, and Murphy and Kevin were about to arrest Herman, but something unexpected happened. Two men on a motorcycle stormed the scene and started shooting at everyone. Pablo had sent these gunmen to kill Herman because he found out he was working with La Cucaracha. Unfortunately, the gunmen managed to kill Kevin and Herman, while Murphy succeeded in killing one of them and arresting the other, whose name was La Kika. La Kika was sentenced, but he was released on bail worth $2 million, which was, of course, paid by Pablo. At this time, Murphy felt that his friend's justice had not been served, so he took his wife and moved to Colombia to pursue Pablo and work on capturing him. Yes, this is how Murphy ended up in Colombia and began working with Colombian officers. And this brings us to the incident at the beginning of the story when I mentioned that Murphy sent a Colombian officer named Carrillo to deal with Poison and Lizard, who were drug dealers. After this operation was completed, we see Murphy heading to the operation site and documenting everything to investigate later. Then we see Gustavo meeting with Pablo, and from their conversation, We learn that Poison and Lizard were indeed working with Pablo. Gustavo also informs Pablo that there is an American officer named Murphy investigating the case, and Pablo begins to feel a serious threat from Murphy. As a result, Gustavo orders a large bounty of $500,000 for anyone who kills Murphy. However, you should know that the case of Poison and Lizard happened a long time after Murphy settled in Colombia. So, let's go back a bit to see what Murphy did since arriving in Colombia. Going back, we see Murphy and his wife, Connie, on the plane heading to Colombia. At this time, Pablo's operations were booming like never before, to the extent that Letter, a major drug dealer working with Pablo, had bought a large island in the Bahamas and set up a gas station and an aircraft rest stop there. Meanwhile, Pablo and Gustavo had expanded their operations and set up many cocaine manufacturing labs. They also brought in scientists from Germany to improve the quality of the cocaine and conceal it better. The scientists hid the cocaine in unexpected places, such as Coca-Cola bottles and other hard-to-detect locations. In another scene, we see Pablo and Gotcha standing by a boat and discovering that the boat contains drugs. Gotcha brings his dog to sniff out the drugs, but the dog does not detect anything because the drugs were hidden between layers of glass in the boat, which astonishes Gotcha. Then Gustavo tells Pablo that the drug money has increased so much that they are unable to launder it. Pablo responds that he will handle it. Indeed, Pablo sets up a small taxi company to launder the money. However, the money was far too much to be laundered through one or two companies, so they decided to do something crazy, bury the money in secret locations known only to Pablo and Gustavo. But as they say, news cannot be hidden. Consequently, news of Pablo's wealth and drug dealers spread throughout Colombia. We now see a gang called M19, a communist armed group led by someone named Ivan the Terrible. This group was so reckless that they broke into a museum and stole a sword belonging to Simon Bolivar, the liberator of Colombia. The gang decided to kidnap Martha Ochoa, the sister of the Ochoa brothers we mentioned earlier. They indeed kidnapped her and demanded a large ransom from her brothers. On the same day Martha was kidnapped, Murphy and his wife Connie arrived in Colombia. Upon their arrival, an airport official decided to detain them for a while due to their American nationality. Later, a corrupt officer arrived and asked Murphy about his reason for being in Colombia. Murphy told him he would be working at the American embassy. After the officer checked Murphy's passport and realized he was an officer, he took the passport to verify it. This passport eventually reached the drug dealers, who became aware of all the American officers present in Colombia. At this time, Pablo appeared on TV in an interview with a host named Virginia Vallejo, talking about himself as a businessman and portraying himself as someone involved in charitable work. Through this, we get a glimpse that Pablo is trying to improve his image because he plans to enter politics. But beyond all this, my friend, remember Vallejo well, as she will get very close to Pablo and will play a significant role in the future. At the same time that events were unfolding in Colombia, there was an officer named Javier Peña working in American drug enforcement at the embassy. Javier was involved with a woman named Helena, and he planned to help her move to America if she provided him with important information. One day, Javier went to the embassy and met Murphy for the first time. From that moment, they became partners in fighting drug dealers, including Pablo and others. Later, they discovered that drug dealers would be gathering at a specific hotel, so they enlisted the help of Officer Carrillo and went to the hotel to photograph all the dealers, including Pablo. At the meeting in the hotel, Pablo revealed his plans to create a new criminal organization that he would run, protect, and secure. All attendees agreed to Pablo's plans, and from that point, Pablo became the leader of almost all drug dealers in Colombia. Pablo decided to name his organization Death to the Kidnappers and make its first operation against the M19 gang to retrieve Martha Ochoa. After the meeting, a small celebration was held at the hotel, and Helena found herself at the event. Gotcha became interested in Helena, and she tried to extract information from him. However, Gotcha sensed something was wrong and handed Helena over to his men for torture. At this time, Javier, Murphy, and Carrillo were waiting for Helena to obtain information from her but found no trace of her. Javier decided to rescue her himself, and he, along with Carrillo and several soldiers, went to the hotel, where they eliminated Gotcha's men and freed Helena. Meanwhile, Pablo began executing his plans against the M19 gang, sending his men to kill the gang members without negotiation. On one occasion, Ivan went to the gang's headquarters and found all his men dead, with a message threatening that they must return Martha Ochoa or everyone and their families would die. Ivan was frightened by the threat and returned Martha Ochoa to Pablo, then came himself to Pablo with the legendary Simon Bolivar sword. Ivan asked Pablo to kill him, but he expressed concern for his family. However, Pablo accepted the sword as a gift only and did not harm him or his family. In return, Pablo decided to employ Ivan in his operations. Over time, Pablo's reputation and his organization death to the kidnappers grew significantly. One day, Murphy returned home with his wife, Connie, to find their home destroyed and open, and their cat had been killed. Murphy realized after meeting Javier that the drug dealers had discovered his identity through information leaked by airport workers. Murphy and Javier went to the American embassy in Colombia to report what had happened and asked the ambassador for assistance in the investigation. The ambassador informed them of a corrupt officer named Suarez who might help them. Javier and Murphy used money to obtain information from Suarez about who had entered Murphy's home. After interrogating the airport workers, it turned out that the information had been leaked to Poison, who was behind the attack on Murphy's home. So, the two decided to pursue Poison. Meanwhile, Vallejo, the journalist, grew closer to Pablo, and Pablo aimed to enter politics to support the poor, as he had once been poor himself. Vallejo used her connections to arrange a meeting for Pablo with lawyer Duque, who represented the ruling Liberal Party in Colombia. An agreement was reached between Pablo and Duque, where Duque would take $300,000 for himself, and in return, Pablo would be introduced to the Minister of Justice to support him in the elections, with an additional donation of $3 million from Pablo to the Ministry of Justice. Initially, Lara, the Minister of Justice, refused to accept the donation because he was an honest minister. However, he was eventually convinced after Duque persuaded him that they would benefit from the funds for the Ministry of Justice. In a later phase, we see Pablo talking with Poison and some of his gang members, instructing them to go meet the Minister of Justice and deliver $3 million as agreed. They agree to the task, but on the other side, Carrillo, Murphy, and Javier are monitoring Poison's phone to determine his destination. They decide to set up an ambush to catch him, but a small issue arises. Suarez, a corrupt individual working for Pablo, contacts Pablo and demands money in exchange for important information. Pablo learns from Suarez that the police have set up an ambush for Poison and that he is in danger. Consequently, Pablo quickly calls Poison and orders him to return immediately with the money. Poison complies and returns, preventing the police from capturing him. Subsequently, Pablo continues organizing conferences to boost his standing before the elections, and he does not forget to distribute money to the poor to increase his popularity. During one of the conferences, his wife Tata is also present, as is Vallejo. Tata notices the interest between Pablo and Vallejo, and when she returns home, she asks Pablo to completely avoid Vallejo. Pablo denies any infidelity and reassures her. Tata's health deteriorates due to the approaching delivery date, and Pablo takes her to the hospital. Meanwhile, his cousin Gustavo arrives and urges him to leave politics altogether. Pablo disregards this advice, and Tata gives birth to a daughter, which makes him extremely happy. At the same time, Gacha speaks with the Ochoa brothers, expressing their dissatisfaction with Pablo's decision to leave the work to them as Pablo aimed to reach the Senate to increase his influence. They seem to be contemplating rebellion against Pablo but fear taking action. That night, Pablo meets with Letter and decides to appoint him to manage the cocaine laboratories instead of his cousin Gustavo, as Pablo felt disgruntled with Gustavo because of what he said in the hospital. Pablo asks Letter about the dissatisfaction of Gacha and the Ochoa brothers regarding the elections, and Letter informs him that they are indeed upset as they see no benefit in his candidacy. From the next day, Letter starts managing the cocaine laboratories, and production significantly increases. At the American embassy, the ambassador meets with Murphy and Javier and they discover that Pablo might enter the Senate, which cannot be allowed. They need to prove that Pablo is a criminal and deals in drugs. They decide to search through Pablo's old files and discover that Suarez had information about Pablo's past arrest for smuggling. They also find contacts of officers who can provide details about the old case. However, Suarez was corrupt and was selling information to both Murphy, Javier, and Pablo, who was sending his men to kill anyone who could prove anything against him. After all their avenues were blocked, they decide to target the photographer who took pictures of Pablo in the old case. They manage to locate the photographer, retrieve the photos from him, and place him under witness protection to ensure his safety. Murphy, the ambassador, and Javier meet with Minister Lara and present the photos proving Pablo's involvement in drug trafficking. Lara, who considers himself honest, decides to expose Pablo and begins a campaign against drug dealers. After a while, elections begin in Colombia and Pablo loses the election. However, Pablo does not give up as he managed to get one of the winners to resign his Senate seat, thus officially becoming a member of the Senate. Some time later, the first Senate session begins, and Pablo enters, extremely happy as he had dreamed of this moment for a long time. However, Pablo's joy fades when Lara, during the session, declares that Pablo is a drug dealer unfit to be a senator. He proves his claim by showing the photo of Pablo from the smuggling case. Pablo, enraged, leaves the place and then starts a media war against Lara. Lara successfully exposes Gacha as a drug dealer who owns a football team, forcing him to leave the club. He also exposes the Ochoa brothers, leading to the Colombian government sending Lara to Czechoslovakia as an ambassador for his protection against assassination. On the other hand, we see Pablo sitting with Gustavo and his wife, deeply upset about what happened, and he decides to take revenge on Lara before he travels. On the day Lara was scheduled to travel, Pablo appears on television and announces his resignation from the Senate and retirement from politics. However, this announcement is not genuine. Pablo has arranged for Lara's assassination. When Lara heads to the airport, he is shot by Pablo's men and is killed in a very tragic scene. After Lara's death, Murphy and Javier feel anxious as they consider themselves responsible for what happened, especially since Lara was an honorable man. From that moment on, Murphy decides he will not work with any more honorable individuals in this dirty war. Despite the sadness left by Lara's death, there are positive aspects. One of the people involved in the killing was captured and confessed that Pablo Escobar ordered the murder. Based on this confession, Pablo became a wanted criminal. Additionally, Colombia and the United States reached an agreement stating that if Colombia captures anyone accused of drug trafficking, they can be extradited to the United States for trial, which caused panic among drug dealers and traffickers. Meanwhile, Pablo meets with Gacha, Gustavo, Letter, and the Ochoa brothers, and they decide to work hard against the issue of extradition to the US. They take all possible measures to protect themselves. Gacha hires a group of mercenaries for protection, Letter turns to the media to speak out against the extradition campaign, and the Ochoa brothers collaborate with a public relations firm to organize a massive campaign against the extradition of criminals to America. At the same time, Pablo employs a different method. He sends letters to prominent politicians warning them against supporting the extradition campaign and threatens to kill them and their families if they do. Pablo also sends letters to judges warning them against ruling on any criminal for extradition to America, forcing judges to wear masks during trials to protect their identities. Nevertheless, Pablo manages to discover their identities and kills them. In a meeting with a representative of the U.S. military and a U.S. intelligence representative in Colombia, the U.S. president announces a reduction in support for the Drug Enforcement Administration, deciding to allocate support to the military and intelligence to combat communism, which is considered the real threat to America. Consequently, the DEA's support is reduced to only $100,000 annually. Based on this, Javier and Murphy use this amount effectively. Javier bribes General Jaramillo of the Colombian police with $100,000, requesting him to assign Carrillo to Pablo's case, which Jaramillo agrees to. Carrillo begins his work quickly, taking Murphy and Javier to one of Pablo's men who had been previously captured. Carrillo tortures this man until he confesses Pablo's location. Based on the information they obtain, they raid Pablo's house, but find it empty as Pablo and Gustavo have managed to escape. They find an unburned piece of paper at the scene of the fire, which contains an address. When they go to this address, they discover it is Pablo's accountant's address. The accountant is arrested, and more than 6,000 papers and files incriminating Pablo are found. The evidence is sent to the Supreme Court of Colombia, but Jaramillo refuses to accept any evidence from Murphy or Javier, claiming that it belongs to the state due to his anger over the small bribe he received. Murphy steals a document from the evidence and discovers it contains a money transfer to someone named Cecil. They go to Suarez to find out who Cecil is, and he tells them that Cecil is a former American pilot who works illegally with Pablo, smuggling drugs for him. Murphy then goes to the U.S. intelligence representative and asks about Cecil. He confirms Cecil's address, and Cecil is subsequently captured. He agrees to cooperate with them in exchange for a pardon. They agree, and Cecil provides them with a photo showing Pablo in Nicaragua, with members of the Communist Council there who are involved in drug trafficking. This photo is a strong piece of evidence against Pablo and represents a significant breakthrough in the case. Murphy takes the photo and presents it to the U.S. ambassador, who in turn sends it to Washington. The issue spreads widely, and because the U.S. president had a negative stance towards communists, he decides to launch a broad war against communists and drug traffickers as their allies. As a result, Murphy and Javier receive unprecedented support in terms of weapons, money, and other resources, enabling them to reach and destroy many of Pablo Escobar's laboratories. In one of these labs, Letter is captured and extradited to the U.S., where he is sentenced to 135 years in prison. After these events, Pablo meets with Gacha, Gustavo, and the Ochoa brothers to inform them that the war has begun and he will not back down. Meanwhile, Javier and Murphy are in a restaurant when Connie, Murphy's wife, arrives with her friend Elisa, who works in a hospital. Elisa, who is secretly a member of the M19 communist group, recognizes everyone in the restaurant. On the same day, Pablo meets with Yvonne, the leader of the M19 group, and offers them a large sum of money to carry out a mission. The group agrees. After Pablo leaves, Elisa speaks with Yvonne and asks him about Pablo's visit. Yvonne reveals that Pablo was seeking their support for a major operation against the state. Elisa believes this is a mistake, so she goes to Connie the next day, confesses that she is a member of M19, and asks her to take her to any officer at the US Embassy to reveal important information. Connie agrees and takes Elisa to Javier, who learns all the information she obtained from Yvonne and contacts Murphy. They discover that Yvonne and his group are planning a catastrophic operation and rush to contact the ambassador. However, the news leaks, and it is discovered that the M19 group has taken over the Colombian Supreme Court and killed many judges and officers. Their goal was to burn 6,000 documents proving Pablo's involvement in drug trafficking. Indeed, they succeeded, and now there is no evidence to prove Pablo's involvement in anything. Subsequently, Murphy and Javier meet with the ambassador, military, and intelligence representatives, and try to convince them that the operation was staged to protect Pablo. However, they decide to stop pursuing Pablo and focus solely on the communists. Murphy and Javier decide not to mention Elisa as the source of the information to keep her safe. On the other hand, Pablo meets with Yvonne and his group to pay them, but he actually intends to eliminate them to prevent them from confessing their agreement with him. And indeed, they are eliminated. After a while, presidential candidate Galan appears in his speech and announces that he will fight drug traffickers, leading Caesar, Galan's assistant, to believe that Galan will face problems with drug traffickers. Meanwhile, Javier falls in love with Elisa and decides to smuggle her out of Colombia to protect her from drug traffickers and U.S. security forces that also seek to kill her because she is a communist. The next day, Javier meets with Murphy, and they decide to get Elisa out by any means necessary. Subsequently, Javier and Murphy meet with the ambassador, military, and intelligence representatives. They were asked to hand over the communist who provides them with information, but they refuse, which displeases the military and intelligence representatives. Later, Murphy and Javier inform them that Pablo and the drug traffickers are hiding in Panama under the protection of the Panamanian president. However, everyone refuses to believe this as the Panamanian president is an ally of the US president. It turns out that Pablo and his group are indeed there. They were considering returning to Colombia, but everyone was convinced that their presence in Panama was currently the best solution. In Panama, Pablo is with his wife at a restaurant, where he tells her he wants to return to Colombia, even if it means starting a war. He decides to launch a campaign to take revenge on Galan and then control the next presidential candidate to refuse to extradite drug traffickers to the U.S., which would make it easier for him to return to Colombia. On the same day, Galan is assassinated during a conference. The following day, at the morning ceremony, where Caesar, Galan's family, and others attended, Galan's son asks Caesar to run for president. Caesar decides to run for the presidency. As soon as Caesar begins his presidential campaign, we see Pablo, Gacha, and the Ochoa brothers board a plane returning to Colombia. After returning, Pablo sits with Duque and Vallejo and asks them to go to Caesar and convince him to cooperate with Pablo and the traffickers instead of the US. Duque and Vallejo do indeed meet with Caesar and ask him to refuse extraditing anyone to the U.S., assuring him that this is the only way to avoid being assassinated like Galan. Caesar becomes furious at this threat, kicks them out, and contemplates what to do about Pablo. While Caesar is making his decision, we cut to Javier, who is sitting in his office when an American military officer arrives and informs him that they have captured a member of the M19 group and will force him to confess that Elisa is helping Murphy and Javier, which would lead to her, Javier, and Murphy being prosecuted. Javier goes to an embassy official and asks her to prepare fake documents for Elisa so he can smuggle her out of the country. Meanwhile, the American military officer is seen torturing a member of the M19 group until he confesses that Elisa is indeed collaborating with Javier and Murphy, and that they are hiding her. The officer is thrilled with this confession and plans to arrest her. Elsewhere, we see Carrillo still continuing his work, constantly monitoring Pablo's phone in an attempt to catch him. On one occasion, Carrillo is sitting in a restaurant with his wife when one of Pablo's men bursts in and opens fire, intending to kill him. However, Carrillo manages to kill the attacker. Afterward, Carrillo calls Pablo and tells him that he's monitoring his house and knows his family, just as Pablo knows Carrillo's family. He threatens Pablo, saying that if Pablo involves his family in their conflict again, Carrillo will take out Pablo's family. Pablo hangs up, seething with rage, and decides to start a war against the police and the entire country. Pablo then sits with Gotcha, who tells him that he also plans to start a major war to prove the power of the drug traffickers. Gotcha intends to purchase very powerful missiles to fight the police and army. A man named Hartunga, Gotcha's assistant, joins them. After learning about the plan, Hartunga goes to meet Murphy and Javier and informs them that Gotcha will be in a certain city to buy the missiles. He offers them the chance to arrest Gotcha in exchange for protection and a reward. Murphy and Javier agree to consider it. The two then meet with the ambassador and brief her on everything that has happened. The ambassador asks Javier to go after Gotcha and try to capture him, while asking Murphy to stay behind to protect Caesar, who will appear at an upcoming conference. Before Javier leaves the city, Murphy hands him the forged documents for Elisa so he can smuggle her out. Meanwhile, Gotcha goes to the city to buy the missiles and successfully purchases one, but it's still unclear how Javier plans to capture him. Next, we cut to the conference where Caesar is speaking. At the start of the conference, Caesar had decided to refuse to extradite drug traffickers to the US. However, feeling guilty, he suddenly announces in front of everyone that if he becomes president, he will cooperate with the US and extradite all drug traffickers. This declaration sparks a major war between the government, drug traffickers, and Pablo. The war begins a few days later, as we see poison pass through a police checkpoint and, without warning, kills all the officers there, two, to be precise. Poison calls Pablo, who is sitting with his son, and informs him that he has killed 2 police officers. Pablo rejoices and instructs Poison to spread the word among his men that anyone who kills a police officer will receive a large monetary reward. From that moment, a massacre against police officers begins, claiming the lives of more than 200 officers in the city. We now turn to Murphy, who is inspecting his car as he plans to smuggle Elisa and is worried that the military officer may be spying on him. Indeed, he finds a bug in his car. He decides to use the bug to deceive the military officer. Shortly after, we see the military officer listening to a conversation between Murphy, his wife, and Elisa, and he believes that Murphy is planning to smuggle Elisa. The officer goes to confront Murphy and stops him, but he doesn't find Elisa or anyone else with him. In the end, it's revealed that Elisa had been with Connie, Murphy's wife, the whole time and had been safely smuggled out of the country. After Murphy finished dealing with Elisa's case, he decided to resume his search for Pablo. He went to Caesar and met with him, his assistant, and his chief bodyguard, Eduardo. Murphy informed them that he was on their side, and that if they needed anything to help protect them from Pablo, they could let him know. They thanked him and told him they would stay in touch. Later, Murphy met with one of his men, who gave him a picture of a Spanish man and told him that this Spaniard had arrived in Colombia and was received by Poison himself, which meant that this Spaniard was particularly important to Pablo. Murphy decided to follow this Spaniard and learn about his connection to Pablo. Meanwhile, the Spaniard was with Pablo and Gustavo, and from their conversation, we learn that the Spaniard is a bomb maker. Pablo asked him to make a bomb in exchange for 3,000 kilograms of cocaine. However, the Spaniard refused, which angered Gustavo, who was about to kick him out. But Pablo wasn't satisfied with that and continued to persuade him until the Spaniard finally agreed to make the bomb in exchange for 5,000 kilograms of cocaine. Gustavo, however, started feeling that Pablo was tarnishing his reputation more and more in front of everyone. The biggest proof of this was when he went to Martha Ochoa, where we discover that Gustavo secretly loves Martha, and no one knows about their relationship. Gustavo spoke to Martha, upset with Pablo for damaging his image. Martha suggested they run away together, but Gustavo refused. Meanwhile, Murphy decided to investigate the Spaniard, so he went to Suarez and asked him about his identity. But Suarez refused to disclose any information to Murphy, telling him that he only dealt with Javier. Murphy got angry and hit him, forcing Suarez to give him information about the Spaniard. After that, Murphy went to the embassy and met with the ambassador, the military representative, and the intelligence representative. He told them that he had discovered that the Spaniard was a bomb maker, and he believed Pablo had brought him to make a bomb to assassinate Caesar. Murphy asked them to search the intelligence files for any information about the Spaniard that might help in the case, and they agreed. Indeed, Murphy went into the intelligence archive and began searching until he discovered many details about the Spaniard, confirming that Pablo had brought him to make a large bomb targeting Caesar. Murphy and the ambassador then went to meet Caesar and his assistant Eduardo. They suggested that Caesar postpone any trips until the Spaniard was captured. But Caesar refused this idea and insisted on continuing his travels because he wanted to tour the country and speak to people about his campaign, not allowing anything to stop him. Murphy and the ambassador left the meeting, frustrated. At the same time, the Spaniard had finished making the bomb, placing it inside a recording device. Pablo then sent his men to a young man named Jamie, a newcomer working with Pablo. Pablo told him that he wanted him to travel on the same plane as Caesar and take the recording device with him to record conversations. Jamie agreed to the task, unaware that the device contained a bomb and not just a recorder, and that he would die along with Caesar. Meanwhile, Suarez, as usual, contacted Pablo and informed him that Murphy was searching for him and the Spaniard. Pablo became furious and sent poison to kill Suarez, as he did not want to work with someone who was also cooperating with U.S. drug enforcement. Days passed, and at the airport, Suarez was preparing to travel, as was Jamie, who believed he was carrying a recording device to document conversations. Before the plane took off, Murphy arrived and pleaded with Caesar not to travel, warning him that he would be assassinated. This time, Caesar got scared and decided not to travel. Jamie, however, boarded the plane and used the recording device as Pablo had instructed him, triggering the explosion and killing Jamie and everyone on board. Caesar, of course, remained unharmed as he hadn't boarded the plane. Elsewhere, we see Carrillo and Javier, who finally managed to locate Gotcha. They went to the site and confronted Gotcha and his men. Gotcha took the opportunity to grab his son Freddy and attempt to flee, while his men exchanged gunfire with Carrillo, Javier, and the police. Gotcha took a car and managed to escape, but Carrillo and his team chased him until they eventually killed both him and his son. This marked the first major successful hit by Carrillo and his team against the drug traffickers, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. After some time passed, we learned that the plane explosion had killed more than 107 people. As a result of this bombing, Pablo literally transformed into a globally wanted terrorist, becoming the #1 target in the United States. We now see Javier, Murphy, and Carrillo visiting Natalia, the wife of Jamie, the unfortunate young man who died in the plane explosion. They begin by asking Natalia if Pablo forced Jamie to board the plane or if someone else was involved. They warn her that it's in her best interest to cooperate with them so they can catch Pablo, as he will kill her and her young daughter to cover his crime. However, Natalia refuses to talk, fearing for her life. On the other side, we see Pablo bidding farewell to his entire family as he decides to escape to a safe place until things calm down. He then speaks to Poison and orders him to kill Natalia so that no one can link the plane incident back to him. Poison agrees, and we wait to see what he will do. We then move on to Caesar, who has won the election, and a celebratory event is held in his honor. During the event, Caesar sits with a man named Tobar, the former president of Colombia. Caesar asks Tobar for advice, and Tobar tells him not to trust the Americans because they could destroy him. Caesar agrees with his advice and acts on it. The next day, Caesar summons the U.S. ambassador, Murphy, Javier, and representatives from the military and intelligence agencies. He informs them that he will continue pursuing Pablo and won't stop. However, he asks them to stop their nationwide search for Pablo, as that is not their jurisdiction. After this meeting, we see the army and police continuing to attack Pablo's locations, hoping to capture him. But, due to the many informants Pablo has recruited, he escapes easily every time. Pablo doesn't remain silent about this and begins bombing various vital locations across the country in response to Caesar's actions. As the pressure on him increases, Pablo decides to meet with a gang leader named Pacho Herrera and asks him to collaborate in drug trafficking. However, Pacho refuses for several reasons, the most important being that he is arrogant and dislikes Pablo. Pablo is not pleased with his refusal, so he threatens to kill him and leaves. Afterward, Pacho decides to cause trouble for Pablo. In another scene, we see Pacho meeting the Ochoa family and revealing to them that their sister is having an affair with Gustavo, Pablo's cousin, and that they are secretly meeting regularly. Of course, the family is shocked by this news, and we don't yet know how they will react to their sister. Away from Pacho, we see Pablo sending Duque to meet Caesar to propose a deal. Pablo would stop the bombings in exchange for Caesar halting the pursuit of his men and raiding his warehouses. However, Caesar rejects this deal, and Duque returns to Pablo to inform him of what happened. Pablo becomes furious and asks Gustavo for advice. Gustavo tells him that the only solution is to kidnap important figures in the country to pressure Caesar into agreeing to negotiations. Pablo agrees and begins having his men kidnap the families of politicians and celebrities. We see that journalist Vallejo is always the first to cover these events, as she knows about them in advance from Pablo. In one instance, while Vallejo is covering a kidnapping, she meets a famous TV presenter, the daughter of former President Tobar. The presenter indirectly accuses Vallejo of having some connection to Pablo, which upsets Vallejo. She then goes to Pablo and asks him to kidnap Tobar's daughter, explaining that this would benefit him because she is a very famous figure. Pablo agrees and sends his men to kidnap her and imprison her in an unknown location. Later, Pablo brings Tobar's daughter and asks her to record a video confirming that she is fine, intending to pressure President Caesar into negotiating with him. Tobar's daughter is forced to comply, and the video is recorded and broadcast everywhere. Caesar, Tobar, and his wife watch the video together, and Tobar demands that Caesar negotiate with Pablo to release his daughter. Tobar threatens to cut off the financial support he provides and to tarnish Caesar's reputation in the media if he doesn't comply. Caesar is troubled by the situation and thinks carefully. In the end, he decides to negotiate with Pablo. We now see Pablo taking Gustavo to a location in the mountains, where he tells him that he intends to build a fortified castle in this beautiful place, which will serve as a safe haven to protect him from the police and any other threats. Pablo informs Gustavo that he will make this castle part of the deal with Caesar. Gustavo is thrilled and wholeheartedly agrees with the plan. On the other side, we see Poison and two killers searching for Natalia, Jamie's wife, to kill her. They arrive at her home, but they don't find her, as she had taken her young daughter and hidden at a friend's house. However, at one point, Poison and the killers manage to find Natalia and kill both her and her friend. The crazed Poison tries to kill Natalia's young daughter too, but he fails as Murphy and Javier arrive just in time. Poison and his companions escape, and Murphy and Javier try to chase them, but unfortunately, they are unable to catch them. Murphy returns to the house where Natalia had been and takes her daughter, deciding with his wife Connie to raise the child together. A week later, we see Pablo and Gustavo fleeing through the forest on their way to meet President Caesar when the police ambush them and open fire, forcing them to flee quickly. Pablo realizes that Caesar is trying to capture them before any agreement can be made, and he decides to take revenge and make Caesar regret this action. Pablo goes to Tobar's daughter and asks her to record another video demanding that Caesar agree to the negotiations, or else she and all the other hostages will be killed. Tobar's daughter agrees and records the video, which is broadcast widely, but Caesar remains unfazed and continues his attempts to capture Pablo. One day, U.S. intelligence manages to intercept a signal from the location where Tobar's daughter is being held. Carrillo and his team are sent to rescue her, but by mistake, they end up killing her instead of saving her. A funeral is held for Tobar's daughter, during which her mother speaks to Caesar and asks him to agree to Pablo's terms because all the other hostages will face the same fate if he doesn't. Caesar is finally moved by this and decides to accept Pablo's conditions. Later, Eduardo informs Murphy, Javier, and the ambassador that the president has decided to accept Pablo's terms, and he also tells them that the terms include Pablo admitting to being a drug dealer, but he will receive a very light sentence. Most importantly, Pablo will serve his prison sentence in his private castle, which he is building in the mountains, and the guards at the castle will be his own men, while the police will stay completely away from him. Everyone acknowledges that Pablo has imposed his will on the president, but Eduardo explains that this is the only solution to end the chaos that Pablo has caused, which they have been unable to control. Eduardo then leaves. On the other side, we see Pablo meeting with Duque, Vallejo, and Gustavo, and they celebrate the good news together. After the celebration, Pablo talks to Duque and tells him that this is not the end of the work, and his mission now is to try to reduce the prison time that Pablo will serve in his private prison. Afterward, Vallejo talks to Pablo and tells him that she will distance herself from him for the time being after his official admission as a drug dealer, as being close to him will damage her reputation as a journalist. Pablo responds by telling her that she must stay close to him whether she likes it or not. Pablo then talks to Gustavo and tells him that he knows about his relationship with Martha, the sister of the Ochoa brothers, and asks him to stay away from her to avoid causing any problems with the Ochoa brothers. Gustavo tells him that he will think about it. In the end, Pablo and Gustavo summon two of their men, Fernando and Kiko, and tell them that their mission will be to manage the business while Pablo and Gustavo are imprisoned in their castle. Pablo reassures them that they will be in constant contact with them, so they won't truly be imprisoned. Fernando and Kiko agree and thank Pablo for his great trust. On the other side, we see Carrillo meeting with Javier and Murphy, telling them that they must capture Pablo and Gustavo before the deal with Caesar is finalized. If the deal goes through, they will never be able to catch them. Murphy and Javier agree with him and decide to act on this matter immediately. At the same time, we see Pacho sitting with Vallejo, trying to convince her to turn against Pablo and work with him, but she doesn't give him a final response. During the conversation, Pacho hints to Vallejo that he is planning to get rid of Pablo soon, though he doesn't reveal how or when this will happen. As we know, Pacho doesn't speak in vain, and proof of this is that on the same night, Pablo is with his wife Tata at home when suddenly a bomb explodes in the house. Fortunately, neither Pablo nor Tata is harmed. Pablo quickly rushes to check on his son and finds him safe, but he finds his young daughter injured in her ear, which will cause her to lose hearing in one ear for life. Pablo loses his mind and tries to figure out who did this and who betrayed his location and leaked the information. The next day, the Ochoa brothers receive a picture showing Gustavo with their sister Martha, confirming that there is an illicit relationship between Gustavo and their sister, which angers them greatly. They go to Pacho and ask him to intervene and find a solution, suggesting that they confess their crimes to receive a lighter sentence, similar to Pablo. In return, they will hand Gustavo over to the police before the deal with President Caesar is completed. Pacho is thrilled by this proposal and agrees to help them. Not long after, we see the Ochoa brothers going to the police and confessing everything they know about Gustavo, including where he might be. Later, we see Gustavo in a hotel with Martha when suddenly Carrillo and a group of officers raid the place and arrest him. They take him to a remote location, where Carrillo talks to Gustavo and tells him that his kidnapping is illegal, and that the president has banned them from approaching either him or Pablo. Carrillo tells Gustavo that he could easily kill him if he doesn't tell them where Pablo is. But despite the threats, Gustavo refuses to reveal Pablo's location. Carrillo gets angry and orders the officers to beat Gustavo severely until he dies in a shocking scene. The news reaches Pablo and his family, and they are deeply saddened by Gustavo's murder. Pablo decides to take revenge and start a war against everyone. A few days later, Vallejo comes to Pablo and tells him that the Ochoa brothers betrayed Gustavo and that Pacho helped them. Pablo loses his mind and orders his men to kill Pacho. At that time, Pacho is playing a soccer match with his friends when suddenly Pablo's men storm the field and open fire on everyone. Pacho quickly escapes, and luckily he manages to get away without being killed. The next day, the news broadcasts that the Colombian House of Representatives has decided not to extradite drug traffickers to the United States, which was a decision that Pablo had been aiming for from the beginning. Pablo feels victorious and holds a funeral for Gustavo on the same day. A short time later, a plane arrives for Pablo, and Eduardo steps out, carrying with him the papers of the deal that was made with Caesar. Pablo signs the papers and surrenders himself, going with Eduardo to be detained in the prison that he built himself. On the same day that Pablo is imprisoned, Murphy receives news of poison being in a certain restaurant, accompanied by a large number of Pablo's killers and men. Murphy immediately sends Carrillo and his men to the restaurant, and they manage to kill everyone. As for Pablo, he settles into his fake prison where he lives a luxurious life. A truck would come to him daily, loaded with everything he desires, and the driver of the truck is named Basha, a name to remember later. Aside from the truck and its driver, we see one of Pablo's men, named Velasco, arriving and informing him that Pacho and his gang want to reconcile with him. Pablo agrees to the reconciliation but insists that first, he must kill some of Pacho's new men to teach him a lesson. Velasco agrees and relays the message to his men. Later, we see Pacho angry and saddened by the loss of his men, but he meets with Fernando and Kiko, who are running Pablo's business. Pacho tells them he is willing to pay $10 million to end the war. Fernando and Kiko relay the offer to Pablo, but the amount does not please him. Pablo instructs them to tell Pacho that he must pay $30 million, in addition to Fernando and Kiko having to pay $1 million a month instead of $250,000, along with other business profits. Fernando and Kiko are forced to accept the deal out of fear of Pablo's retaliation. On the other side, Javier and Murphy are sitting with Carrillo, who informs them that he will be transferred to Spain for a new assignment. Before his transfer, Carrillo gives Javier and Murphy a photo of Pablo's prison, which reveals that the prison is nothing but a facade. Carrillo asks them to continue tracking Pablo to prove that he is violating the prison agreement he made with Caesar, so they can demonstrate that the prison is not real. Javier and Murphy agree to this directive and decide to follow up on it. Later, Javier and Murphy meet with representatives from the military and intelligence to examine the photos of Pablo's prison. They discover that the prison has a bird tower, and they realize that Pablo uses this tower to send messages to his men outside the prison via birds. The next day, Javier and Murphy observe the prison and indeed see birds leaving the prison, carrying messages requesting money to be sent via the truck driven by Basha through the tunnel. Javier and Murphy start thinking about what the tunnel might refer to, and they discover that it refers to the truck and Basha transporting contraband into the prison. They capture the driver and decide to install cameras and microphones in the truck to document everything happening in it, to prove that Pablo is violating the prison agreement. Every day, Basha enters the prison with the truck and takes pictures of the truck's cargo, which includes alcohol, girls, or contraband items. These photos reach Caesar, and his assistant Eduardo tells him that it's time to transfer Pablo to a real prison. However, Caesar refuses and decides to ignore the matter, believing that moving Pablo might increase his terrorist activities. At the same time, Pablo is celebrating his birthday in his simple prison, where his family and friends come to visit, including Kiko's wife. She informs Pablo that Kiko is unhappy with the increase in the money he receives to $1 million, which makes Pablo suspicious of Kiko and uncomfortable with him. His suspicions are reinforced when Velasco discovers that a large sum of money, amounting to $3 million, was found on land owned by Kiko and Fernando. Velasco suspects that the money was stolen by Fernando and Kiko and buried on the land, reinforcing Pablo's belief that Kiko and Fernando have betrayed him. In reality, the money found on the land belonged to Pablo's accountant, who had been imprisoned earlier and intended to use it upon his release. The accountant had not told anyone about the money's location, but finding it on land owned by Fernando and Kiko strengthens the suspicion that they stole it. Pablo calls Fernando and Kiko to the prison and begins interrogating them about the money. Fernando and Kiko insist that they did not take any money and do not know how it ended up on the land. They confirm that the land originally belonged to Gustavo and that he might have buried the money and then forgotten about it. But Pablo does not believe this and accuses Kiko of being unhappy with the increase in the money, punishing Fernando by beating him severely until he dies, and then sends his men to kill Kiko. Fernando and Kiko's bodies are burned, and they die unjustly despite having committed no crime. On the other side, Gotcha's assistant goes to meet Pacho. Pacho informs Gotcha's assistant that Kiko and Fernando have been killed inside the prison. Pacho asks him to pass this information to Javier and Murphy so they can use it to try to move Pablo to another prison. Gotcha's assistant agrees and goes to meet Javier and Murphy, providing them with the information. Javier and Murphy start thinking about how to handle this information. They realize that if they announce it, Caesar will not take any action, so they decide to act on their own. They go to the newspapers and expose all the illegal activities Pablo is involved in at his prison, in an attempt to pressure Caesar into transferring Pablo to a real prison. The next day, news about the murders and illegal activities at Pablo's prison floods the media, forcing Caesar to move Pablo to a real prison. While Javier and Murphy are sitting in the embassy, happily watching the news, they are summoned to the ambassador's office, where she tells them that they leaked the photos and information about the prisoner killings without her permission, which is a violation of the rules. As a result, they are suspended from work and subjected to an investigation. Javier and Murphy are shocked by this injustice but do not protest. Later, Murphy returns home, but before he can enter, a gang kidnaps him. His wife, finding that Murphy is late, calls Javier to inform him of what happened, so he goes to the embassy to report it. He asks the military representative to handle the matter confidentially and not to inform anyone about it. After a while, the military representative comes to tell him that Murphy has disappeared and asks him to report it. Javier decides to inform the ambassador, but when he arrives at the embassy, he discovers that Murphy is indeed with the ambassador. Murphy recounts to Javier everything that happened, revealing that his kidnappers were Pacho's men with the help of Gotcha's assistant. Pacho tells Murphy that he has a recording showing his request for Carrillo to get rid of poison, which is illegal and could lead to a trial for breaking the law. Pacho demands that Murphy decide whether to cooperate with him or face being reported. Pacho gives Murphy a chance to think and lets him leave. Murphy begins investigating who leaked the information to Pacho, and he becomes convinced that Javier is the one who did it, as no one else knew these details. He tells Javier that Pacho plans to act and kill Pablo in revenge, but Murphy does not know how to achieve that. Javier denies any involvement in the situation, but Murphy does not believe him and leaves. Javier goes to a bar where he meets Gotcha's assistant, and it turns out that he is indeed involved with Pacho and his gang. We will learn more about what he does later in the second season. President Caesar, after learning of Pablo's killing of 2 prisoners, decides to transfer him from his prison to a real prison. Caesar gathers all his men to discuss how to carry out this plan and eventually decides to send a military squad led by someone named General Ariza to capture Pablo. The squad arrives at the prison but fails to capture Pablo or achieve anything. Caesar asks his assistant Eduardo to negotiate with Pablo to convince him to move to a real prison without causing trouble, with the promise of returning to his previous prison after a short period. However, Eduardo arrives at the prison and finds that Ariza's squad has the prison surrounded and cannot capture Pablo. Eduardo meets with Pablo, who tells him what President Caesar requested, but Pablo refuses and asks Eduardo to communicate with Caesar and inform him that Pablo has rejected the deal and that the army present should withdraw so Pablo can leave the prison. Eduardo communicates with Caesar and informs him of Pablo's response. At that moment, Caesar decides to send a special squad to storm the prison, kill Pablo and his men, and rescue Eduardo. Pablo learns that special forces are coming, so he decides to wait and learn more about the situation. Pablo tells Eduardo that the president has broken his promise and that he may be killed or taken hostage, providing enough reason for the squad to storm the prison and kill Pablo. He also tells him that Caesar decided to sacrifice him to get rid of Pablo. However, Pablo tells Eduardo that he will not kill him and will leave him behind, and that it might be the invading forces who kill him. Pablo then leaves the place, and no one knows where he is going. In the end, the special forces storm the prison and begin killing Pablo's men, but they do not find Pablo. They manage to reach Eduardo and rescue him, but they do not find Pablo. Instead, they only find an entrance to a tunnel beneath the prison. They realize that Pablo has escaped through the secret tunnel he had prepared, making him out of their reach. The series ends here, but the story does not conclude. It begins a new chapter of war between Pablo, the police, and the military, which will unfold in the next season. Of course, there are many questions still needing answers, and we will discover them in the upcoming season. If you want interesting movie recaps, like, share, and subscribe to follow us for more movie recaps.